So what's up people, and welcome to the Mission 77 discussion of Spy Family. So Mission 77 came out a week ago, and as always I will leave a link to this mission that's currently being shown on the publisher's official website, Manga Plus, for free to the North American audience. So if you're interested, I will go take a look at it before they pull this mission back. Okay, so Mission 77 was an interesting one. Throughout this entire series, there has been a lot of different types of stories. Some are very funny, some are very touching, some are very intense and action-packed. But overall, they all revolved around something that made the stories feel very connected to the main story. On the other hand, Mission 77 is the first one that I feel is a little bit distant from what's going on in the main story. I didn't really feel any connection to this one, and it almost felt like maybe a filler? I'm not exactly sure. It just didn't feel like a Spy Family chapter. Sure, there was the characters that typically came out like Lloyd, but even though he was there, the overall feeling of this chapter felt distant. And maybe it's because of the fact that this chapter revolves around a character that we haven't even met until now. And although we've met new characters in the past, this character felt like there was really no connection between this character and the overall story that you saw. Now, this character is introduced in the very beginning of Mission 77 when we see him wake up from his sleep screaming because he had a nightmare. And at that time, we are introduced to this gentleman named Thomas Austin. And we're not really sure who he is until we are told that he is the teacher that was in the school bus during the kidnapping by the Red Circus. And it was the teacher that Mr. Henderson eventually replaced when he went to become one of the hostages of the bus. And so I guess there is a connection in that way, in that this gentleman is a teacher at Eden College. And because of that, there is a connection that eventually comes towards meeting with Lloyd. And so, of course, there is this connection that's going on. Why I say it felt distant is even if it was somebody like Mr. Henderson, there was always this revolving feeling of that person having some reason to be there for Operation Strix and the relationships that go on within the family. Most of the characters that come out in the school are directly or indirectly associated with Anya and the family. Even Mr. Henderson, of course, during those side stories that we often see, interact with Anya and help bring that character forward. But in this case, there doesn't seem to be a central figure to which this character is really associated with, and the actual chapter revolves around this character more so than Lloyd. And maybe that's why I feel this distance. Usually when a new character comes out and they interact with Lloyd, Lloyd is the central figure. A good example of that is Agent Daybreak. Although Agent Daybreak came out, he was a character that helped move Lloyd forward in the mission that he needed to do, which was to go into the locked areas of Eden College and see if he needed to change the answers to Anya's test, if you recall. And of course, because Agent Daybreak was such a clumsy fool, it created that satire that was associated with that chapter. Here, it doesn't revolve around Lloyd. And in fact, Lloyd is there as a character to help push this other character who we really have no reason to be associated with, aside from the fact that he was the one that was in the bus during the raid. And maybe that's why it feels a little bit disconnected. But in any case, of course, because he has all this trauma, he does go and see Lloyd. And because he is a teacher at Eden College, Lloyd always finds that these connections and getting to know such individuals may help him eventually in Operation Strix. So he, of course, gladly takes him in and tries to find a reason for his problem. And so, pretending to be a psychiatrist, he starts delving into some of the situations that Thomas Austin is in to try to figure out what part of the incident that occurred during the kidnapping may have created this trauma that is causing these bad dreams, as Thomas mentioned. But as the conversation keeps on going forward, he starts seeing incongruencies in the answers that Thomas brings. And that typically means that either the gentleman is lying or there is something that's going on that's creating questions about the information that Thomas brings out. Of course, now since Lloyd is playing the psychiatrist, he doesn't bring that up at this time. And he says that he will look into this further for Thomas. And in the meantime, he is going to prescribe some medication for him so that he will calm down. And after Thomas leaves, Fiona comes in and mentions to Lloyd that that gentleman was not telling the truth. And Lloyd agrees to that, but he adds one point, which is he's not really sure whether he's trying to lie to us consciously or whether he's just trying to lie to himself. That he really unconsciously feels that this is due to whatever happened in the kidnapping, but somewhere in his unconsciousness, something is kind of moving the truth around. And so he decided to look into this further. So with the follow-up meeting that comes between Thomas and Lloyd, Thomas mentions to Lloyd that things aren't getting better, his nightmares continue to persist, and none of the efforts have succeeded in making him feel better. And that is at that point when Lloyd starts digging further. And he starts asking Thomas about his personal life more. Mostly about his relationship with his wife. And so Thomas continues to talk about this until the point where Thomas starts becoming suspicious and starts asking questions to Lloyd. Why are you prying into my private life? Why aren't you trying to solve this problem that I got from the trauma from the kidnapping? And it is at that time that Lloyd starts telling Thomas that he started looking into some of these things by talking to some of the people around Thomas. And it was at that time that from the conversations that they had, it turns out that his nightmares happened prior to the kidnapping. And so even if there might have been some effect that the kidnapping had, it wasn't the main reason for his trauma. And so there must have been some other trauma that was going on, and that is why Lloyd started delving into his personal life. And after a little bit of prying, finally Thomas comes out to admit that he can never talk about this with his wife because he is living in fear of her. She seems to be the type of person who ridicules and bullies him verbally. And because of that, his personal confidence has been whittled down to the point of being in trauma all the time. And so from this perspective, Lloyd is finally starting to understand this has nothing to do with the Red Circus. It has to do with his relationship with his wife. And from the images that we have about his wife, yeah, you start getting some understanding. Yeah, this guy probably does have severe trauma, considering his wife is basically saying that, yeah, life would be better if you were dead. And so he starts delving into trying to find what the root cause of her displeasure with him is, and Thomas cannot figure it out. Although there seems to be a list that Lloyd already knows about Thomas's character faults, that, yeah, maybe those may be a trigger to some displeasure by his wife. And so it does create this dysfunctional relationship between Thomas and his wife. And because his wife is so aggressive about that, Thomas has fallen into fear. And so Lloyd starts talking about maybe there are things that they need to open up to each other about and to communicate better so that this displeasure between each other starts going down. And of course, Thomas tells him that because he fears her so much, he is not sure how to even bring that communication forward, because if any communication triggers her displeasure to him again and she starts bullying him again, he would not be able to handle that. And so the risk is too high. And it's at that time that Lloyd starts talking about the fact that he needs to be sensitive to her more when having a conversation. And of course, he brings up some examples of that, which are all the skills that he has as a spy to read personal quirks when they are having a conversation. And of course, he brings him up as a thought that anybody can do it. But as we see from Fiona's side, she realizes, it's because he's Agent Twilight that he can read people that effectively, and average people would not be able to do what he's suggesting. But the discussion does go along that indicates that he will try to do whatever Lloyd suggests, and Lloyd suggests treatments such as trying to sleep in the office, and Lloyd assisting him to trying to get a good sleep and calming him down, and maybe that feeling will then help him sleep later on in the day. And of course, this turns into such a traumatic moment where Thomas wakes up screaming again, that all it does is just makes Lloyd become seriously nervous about being married. So it is somewhat a humorous chapter, although I do not see the ultra hilarious moments that I have seen in Tatsuya Endo's other chapters. And the drama that comes out and the relationship that comes out, and maybe that is why I feel this way, is something that you don't really, or at least my case, I don't really care about too much, because I have no idea who this wife is for this new character that came out. And because of that, this relationship and delving into all this feels somewhat meaningless from my perspective, based with regards to how it affects the story. And so maybe that's why I felt like this chapter felt much more distant than most of the other chapters that came out earlier. And so I'm not exactly sure where Tatsuya Endo wants to go from this point on, and the only way we will find out is when chapter 78 comes out. And when it does, I'll bring out another video. I hope you join me at that time. But this is the chapter 77 discussion of Spy Family. If you read it, what'd you think about it? Did you feel it to be kind of a fillerish chapter as I did? Any comments that you can leave will be greatly appreciated. And until the next mission, happy manga reading. And as always, Jaya, nice day everyone.